All right, let's take a look at the skin. We are going to look at the basic model right now. So this is the model that only has one type of skin. It looks like exactly what we're looking at right now. That's not to be confused with other models that have multiple types of skin on them. Like, for instance, they have armpit hair versus skin of the scalp. This is just our normal hairy skin. So what we're looking at here, number one, whenever we're taking a cross section of our skin, we could break it down into three major components. We could break it down into the epidermis that you can see up here. So this purple layer, everything above where my red dot is right now, that is your epidermis. The red dot is tracing the border between the epidermis and what's called the dermis, which goes from right here to basically where you start seeing this fat. So everything above the red dot and then below this, everything from about here to here, this is going to be your dermis. And then once you run into significant amounts of fat or adipose tissue, then we get into what's called the hypodermis down here. So epidermis, dermis, then hypodermis. Now, if we take a look closely at the epidermis, I'm going to zoom in now, so don't get lost. We're going to take a look real closely at the epidermis here. Now, since this is hairy skin, not thick skin, you're not going to see the layer that's called the stratum lucidum. It is not on this model. So instead, from the outside in, we're going to start up here and we're going to move down. We've got the stratum corneum here. So this is all the dead keratinized epithelium up on the top, represented by number 1 here, but it's in this light tan color here, where you get this really significant change in color where it's almost black and very grainy. That's called the stratum granulosum. Then as it transitions into purple, you have two different kinds of cells, or well, rather two different layers that make up our purple cells here. So the first layer in here is called the stratum spinosum. And so the model doesn't do a great job depicting the difference between the stratum spinosum and the stratum basale. The B is indicating the stratum spinosum, and the very obscured here, I believe this should be the letter C, is representing the stratum granulosum. But let me explain exactly how this is oriented. So basically the layer, the most inner layer right here that actually borders the dermis. So it's a simple single cell layer that borders the actual dermis. This is your stratum basale. So if you are the cell that is touching the dermis, then you are part of the stratum basale. Now, if you are not touching the dermis, if you're one layer up from about here all the way up to the top of the purple here, that's the stratum spinosum. So it's sort of a logical thing. So remember, stratum basale is like the basement membrane. It is the most basal, simple, so single layer of cells. And this is where you're going to see melanocytes and actually melanin under a microscope. But that's the stratum basale. Stratum spinosum is everything from the stratum basale up to the stratum granulosum, which again is in black right there. So that is it for the epidermis. We zoom out, pan down, and we'll take a look at the dermis now. So the dermis begins with what's called if we divide the dermis, again going from here to here, this is all dermis. You've got the most superficial layer, which is the papillary layer here. And then below where the papillae end, so those little mountains here in 2 dimensions, once you get to the base of those mountains, from about here all the way down to the hypodermis, we call this area the reticular layer or the reticular dermis. So again, the whole thing from here to here is the dermis, but it can be broken into 2 groups. The papillary layer up here, and then the reticular layer down here, also known as the reticular dermis. Now, within the dermis, you have a lot of stuff going on. You've got sebaceous glands here, and then there's another intact one here, which are always associated with the hair follicles, because they're actually producing an oily secretion simply for the hair follicles. And then you also have what's a general sweat gland right here, that's actually taking a duct all the way to the surface, and that's going to be your conventional sweat. Now, you're also going to see, so those are your 2 glands, sebaceous and sweat, also known as an eccrine gland. Then you're also going to have sensory systems here. One is called a tactile corpuscle, or also known as a Meissner's corpuscle, right up here. They're in the papillae. And then, though not always in the dermis, there's another kind of sensory corpuscle here, sensory neuron, which is the Pacinian corpuscle, also known as a lamellar corpuscle, right down here. So Meissner, Pacinian, those are the two names. Tactile or lamellar here. Also, same names. All right, so the last thing I'm going to talk about are the different layers of the hair follicle, and there's a lot going on down here. So let's take a closer look and try to get this layering correct, because it's a little complicated. Well, it's not so complicated. It's just the layering. It's just different layers on top of each other. But it's really important to just have clarity as to what those layers are. So 11A is just referring to the bulb, which is just this base of the hair follicle itself. Number 12 is referring to another papilla. So this is a papilla of the hair bulb. And this is actually where the blood supply is going to be supplied to the hair follicle, and this is what keeps the hair growing. So during like laser hair removal or something like that, they actually go in and zap those little teeny capillaries, and so there's no longer blood supplied to the hair follicle, and therefore no more hair growth. So moving out from the hair papilla, number 12 there, we have A, which should be kind of intuitive. This is just really the medulla, and then B is the cortex. So the two deepest layers of what we would call true hair, where it's actually the brown stuff. There's the cortex, the medulla, and then C, the third layer, is the cuticle. So cortex, medulla, cuticle. And then D and E are the inner and outer root sheath. And so inner is in pink, going the whole way. Outer is in purple, also traveling the entire length of the root of the hair. And then our other layers here, which I don't think are really on your sheet, but I'll point them out just to explain the model. It's kind of hard to see in the picture here, but there's actually, after E would come F, right? We all know the alphabet. And F is what's called a hyaloid membrane. And then G is what's called the fibrous layer, which you can see right here. So again, F is kind of invisible. If you're looking at the model right now, which you probably are, you can see F there again. That's the hyaloid membrane. And that's pretty much it for the root sheath. Last thing is just the erector pili up there, and you are all set.